Hey, I'm Caitlin, and I have a question for you. What is a social structure? The term is used in social science in a number of different ways. We can talk about discursive structures, cultural structures, material structures, superstructures, networks, fields, hierarchies, mechanisms, laws, organizations. The term is extraordinarily flexible. But what do they have as a common basis? Doug Porpoise suggests that when you boil it all down, there are 4 primary ways that social structure has been conceptualized, each having their own distinct ontologies, sometimes explicit and sometimes implicit. But most importantly, how we conceive of social structure is closely related to how we understand causation and the ontology of the social world. The first account of structure is law-like regularities that govern the behavior of social facts. This is what we might call the positivist account of structure and is focused on the relationship between variables. Social structures are really social facts, patterns of distribution and social laws that flow from these facts and distributions. They are statistical relationships and invariant probabilities which can be discovered through quantitative analysis, ideally able to show the relationship between dependent and independent variables. Subjective elements, whether individual or cultural, have little place within this account, and agents are caught within quasi-deterministic generalities that at once say too much and too little. The second account, like the first, also has to do with patterns, but the focus here is on agents. Social structures are understood as stable patterns that arise from repeated behavior or habits. Social structure is really just an abstraction or summary of human activities in particular times and places. This is like a slow shutter photo. Social structures are the blurred after effect and traces of human activity. We can see such an account in Randall Collins, rational choice theory, and even in some forms of pragmatism. Social structure has no existence beyond human action. In other words, social structures are really just social interactions and interpersonal relations. Accordingly, changes in social structure occur when we modify our practices to conform with or break from patterns. The third account suggests that social structures most resemble rules or resources that shape our behavior and produce the regularities that we see. So the most famous examples of this are in Anthony Giddens and in Pierre Bourdieu. When we act, we do so in conformity with social rules, and we draw on various ideas, beliefs, and practices in response to various situations, either consciously or more often than not subconsciously. As rules, they govern behavior as we learn to follow them. These rules are closely tied to socialization and are part of everything from organizations to discourses to moral systems, even to the way we hold ourselves. Finally, we have an account of structure that focuses on the relations among social positions and social constructs. Here we might think of organizations or Bourdieusian fields that are not reducible to variables, practices, rules, or interactions, but have a relatively autonomous existence and logic of their own. They are a result of the structuring of roles, relations, and positions that we find ourselves thrown into, and grant structures a stubborn and objective reality that make it difficult to change through simple shifts in behavior or belief. These structures exist and exert distinct causal effects, whether actors recognize it or not, based on how a situation is organized. For example, we find ourselves entering into relations between different positions. Take, for example, landlord-renter, capitalist-worker, and find ourselves occupying roles and living amidst institutional and material structures, all of which exert their own distinct causal influences. While it's true that these different accounts of structure need not be mutually exclusive, they are often presented in that way. But philosophically, it's the concept of emergence that differentiates many of these accounts. Emergence refers to the relationship between parts and wholes, in which wholes have different properties from their parts. This can be summed up by the phrase, "the whole is greater than the sum of its parts." But what does this mean? And what does it mean for them to be greater? And in what sense? It's helpful to distinguish between 2 forms of emergence, weak emergence and strong emergence. Weak emergence suggests that a whole can be largely reduced to and predicted by the operations of its component parts, but it's still able to produce distinct effects that are dependent upon the interaction of those parts. If we think back to the account of social structures as being stable patterns or regularities of behavior, we can think of this as a form of weak emergence. Distinct patterns emerge and can affect actors, but have no distinct existence or causal force of their own. It's dependent upon its parts, but quite reducible to them, even if many of these patterns are surprising, unknown, or unexpected. In contrast, we have strong emergence, which is defined by the wholes having powers and properties that are clearly distinct from the properties and powers of its parts. Diamond, graphite, and graphene are all made up of carbon atoms, but are arranged in very different ways that give them very distinct structural properties. But strong emergence also has another quality. The whole is able to act back upon those parts, and this is called downward causation. It's what makes the fourth account of causation different. So like we thought about diamonds, graphite, and graphene, consider social organizations. Take bureaucracies, for example. There are certain qualities and characteristics that make something a bureaucracy, but how it's put together can change the way it operates. Let's think about that. A bureaucracy is not reducible to a group of individual actors. They have things like hierarchies, budgets, policies, and procedures that make them operate as an organization. And depending on how these parts are arranged and executed, different bureaucracies can function in different ways. This is to say, the bureaucracy as a whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So this has implications for how we consider explanation, or rather, reduction. So here's a question that we might consider then. Can the structure or relation that we're studying be reduced down to a more simple part? A lot of researchers might be tempted by this, but let's consider the work of Margaret Archer. Archer uses emergence to argue against reductionism. In order to understand the social world, she suggests that we need to distinguish between structural emergent properties, cultural emergent properties, and personal emergent properties, each of which need to be understood in their own terms, and each of which have distinct types of causal powers that interact in different ways. Social relations, intelligibilia, and agency, which certainly intermingle, need to be kept ontologically distinct and analytically separated if we're trying to understand the generation, transformation, and reproduction of social structures. Individuals find themselves within structures where they take up certain positions and roles which have an effect on them as individuals. They draw upon discourses, images, and narratives which may be related to those positions but are distinct. They can even be seen as out of sync with these structures and have their own variety of causal powers that affect human activity. And yet through it all, individuals remain reflexive. They're deliberators, evaluators, and they have a rich and creative inner life and internal conversation, which have their own intrinsic effects in how they respond to their position within the structure or culture. So what's interesting is the way these different and distinct types of causal powers interact, and this is what we're interested in discovering and explaining. By understanding emergence, we can begin to piece together how social science might approach explanation and prevent reductionistic accounts.